There's a Spiritual Solution to Every Problem by Wayne Dyer, Chapter 11. Where there is despair, hope. Compare the serene and simple splendor of a rose in bloom with the tensions and restlessness of your life. The rose has a gift you lack. It is perfectly content to be itself. It has not been programmed from birth, as you have been, to be dissatisfied with itself, so it has not the slightest urge to be anything other than it is. That is why it possesses the artless grace and absence of inner conflict that among humans is only found in little children and mystics. What is hope but a feeling of optimism, a thought that says things will improve, it won't always be bleak. There's a way to rise above the present circumstances. Hope is an eternal awareness that you do not have to suffer forever, and that somehow, somewhere, there is a remedy for despair that you will come upon if you can only maintain this expectancy in your heart. When we say this line in the St. Francis prayer, we ask for the strength to bring hope to all who are in despair as well as to ourselves. For it is in the presence of a hopeful vision that despair and suffering no longer hold our attention. Despair is an attitude experienced in the mind. It is a way of looking at a life situation and feeling hopeless. There is no despair in the world. You cannot bring home a bucket full of despair. There are only people thinking despairing thoughts. This is a crucial point to understand. There may be many deplorable circumstances that exist in your life and in the lives of others, yet in and of themselves, they are just plain circumstances, facts of life. Despair itself is a mental process that sizes up and views a situation as awful. When you just recognize despair as being a mental attitude, you begin a process of bringing hope into the inner vision of despair and dissolving it. It is impossible for hope and despair to exist simultaneously. One simply cancels the other. Often it is despair that cancels out hope. In this line from St. Francis' prayer, we ask for the strength to reverse this process and cancel despair with a vision of hope. When you think about it, hope too is nothing more than a thought or a vision. Shifting from pessimism to optimism. It is important here to remember that energy has a frequency. In the frequency of despair, the energy is low and you feel depressed or upset. I'm feeling down today describes the despair you feel when your energy is in the low frequencies. As long as you remain in that lower frequency, you'll continue to attract more of that kind of energy. People who live in a constant state of mental despair never allow themselves to speed up and experience the faster, higher frequencies which lead all the way to spiritual energy. Instead, they fuel their low and slow energy by processing almost every event from a pessimistic viewpoint. As soon as you identify with life is difficult, that is precisely what your experience has to be. As always, the central law of the universe prevails. As you think, so shall you be. If you look back in Chapter 1, you'll note that a basic ingredient of spiritual energy is cheerfulness, a view of life in which one is hopeful and optimistic. In this higher energy of optimism, you're likely to say, I'm up today. Up and higher are synonymous. Consequently, the presence of an up vibration nullifies the illusion of pessimism. Again, that familiar reminder that all that God created is good and God created everything. Therefore, despair and pessimism are creations of your mind due to your belief that you are separate from God. In many ways, our sorrow is a falling away from God. Bring optimism to the place where pessimism resides by bringing the energy of God consciousness to the scene of the pessimism, which of course is in our mental realm. The spiritual solution to any and all despair is one: to move your energy up by making conscious contact with God and trusting in that contact, therefore dissolving the images of negativity and pessimism, and two, to radiate outward this higher up energy towards others who are believing in and therefore living lives of quiet desperation. Just by being in the presence of your faster, higher spiritual energy, others can be impacted by your spirit of hopefulness and cheerfulness. In effect, you become a beacon of hope, showing the way to let go of attachments to gloom and despair. By raising your energy, you make it impossible for those around you to hang on to those false ideas of being separate from all that is good, God. Breaking those attachments to gloom and despair. It sounds absurd to say that anyone would want to be attached to his or her gloom, yet that is precisely the case. A long conditioning process of feeling that life is unfair, that someone else is responsible for my sorrows, that no one truly understands, leads inevitably to habitual thoughts of despair. Hanging on to those ideas keeps a person fixed in self-pity, which eventually turns to self-loathing. The reason for staying attached is that the individual who lives in despair never has to take the risk of accepting responsibility for their gloom or to change lifelong patterns. It's a safe haven, and that allows you to suffer in comfort. It is extremely common for people to build their lives on the mistaken notion that without certain things or certain people, they cannot be happy or free. It's almost as if they're programmed to be unhappy. So their attitude is, without my things, without a particular person, without money, without friendship, I am destined to be gloomy. Thus they become conditioned to believe that scarcity is an excuse for despair. We all have swallowed these beliefs to some extent, and consequently we have developed varying degrees of attachments. These attachments are the source of despair because we justify ecstasy when we attain an object, anxiety over losing it, and despair when it's lost. In order to transcend this cycle of attachment, we must remind ourselves of the difference between our ego and our higher self. Ego's voice is always eager to dominate with thoughts like, I am what I have, what I do, what others think of me. If you can remain quiet long enough, God's voice will penetrate with messages such as, none of these things will bring you happiness. They are only illusions. I am your only source of peace. This is your highest self speaking. This is the spiritual solution to all problems related to attachments. In order to be genuinely happy, there's only one thing to do, and that is to deprogram yourself and permanently get rid of those low energy attachments. Now remember, an attachment is not a fact. It's a fantasy in your head, which you have come to believe is real. It is genuinely possible to live in bliss without those attachments. Practice not saying or thinking that you must have a certain someone or something in order to be free of despair. Replace those phrases with the attitude you take to a sunset, a bird in flight, a glorious garden of flowers. You love them for what they are. You release them from any demands you might have on them, and you enjoy them without clinging to them. Do this, and despair that depends on feelings of not having what you need will be undermined and disappear. To rid yourself of attachments, you simply have to drop them. You do this by reminding yourself over and over that you falsely believe that the cause of your unhappiness is that someone or some things are missing from your life. Unhappiness and despair are ideas. You can keep and love all the objects of your attachments without renouncing any of them. You can love in an underlying way and feel peaceful and unthreatened. This is precisely how God loves you, unconditionally, no attachments. In short, the way to eliminate despair is to drop those attachments and relax in the knowing that your highest, fastest vibrating self does not need anything or anyone in order to be fulfilled. Moving into God's energy field of non-attachment provides you with the hope of transcending despair. This means loving everything, including your suffering. Why? Because it offers you the opportunity to witness rather than receive despair. Observing despair. One of the greatest teachers in my life once said, as long as you identify yourself with the body-mind, you are vulnerable to suffering and sorrow. My conclusion from this is that we must learn to be a witness to our body-mind and to all its demands. When I stand back and notice myself, I am no longer identifying myself with the material world. Thus, I am not vulnerable to the sorrow, suffering, and despair that exist in the physical world. In this way, I bring a sense of hope and optimism to the illusion of despair. I observe my body-mind and silently say something like this. Just look at Wayne now. He's actually believing that his despair is real. He acts as if this is really him going through this, and when in fact I'm really him watching his entire plot emerge. If he would only stop and reconnect to spirit, he would awaken from his despair immediately. As the witness, you are not vulnerable because you see yourself from a different place. It's also possible to bring this attitude of the observer to help others who are locked in the torment of their despair. Tell someone to take a step back in his or her mind and to just notice what he or she sees. In this way, you help that person shift from despair to observation. I find it useful to persistently remind myself that I am the noticer rather than what I notice. This allows me to bring the higher, faster energy of spiritual awareness to any scene in which despair is present. Can I really love my despair? Think about this. Suffering ends when you stop thinking of it as suffering. In the words of the Indian saint Sivananda, if you train yourself to rejoice in suffering, if you think that everything is done by God for one's own betterment and uplift, if you welcome pain as a messenger of God to make you remember Him, then pain will not be pain anymore. Suffering will not be suffering anymore. As you ponder these words, be sure to emphasize the conclusion. Pain and suffering do not exist when viewed from the perspective of God. That is, when you move into spiritual energy, the things you despair over dissolve. This thing you have called suffering is really a wonderful blessing. It teaches you to turn to God, or to raise your vibration up to the frequency of spirit, and to bring that loving spirit into the picture, into the present moment. I can honestly say that most of the things that once caused me to despair and suffer in my own life were my greatest moments of growth and my introduction to devotion. I had to learn that the purpose of what I then called suffering was to burn up my ego and become more purified in the process. Those low points of my life provided me with the energy to propel myself to a higher place. If we could know in the midst of our suffering that the experience was a necessary prelude leading to a spiritual advance, then we could rejoice in that suffering, as Vanda suggests. If you could stop right in the center of feeling despair and send love, you would almost immediately know the reason for going through this despair. Even better, you would no longer think of it as despair. You have nullified the illusion of sorrow by bringing the frequency of love to bear on the problem. In short, you are not here to moan and cry about the miseries of the human condition, but to change them through love, strength, and the vitality that is already present in you. This is bringing hope to despair. This is actualizing a spiritual solution to the illusion of despair as a problem. For many, this sounds like a feasible cause of action. However, there are millions of people who insist that this is impossible when one suffers from the ultimate despair, depression. Relatively speaking, depression is a contemporary phenomenon. Today, more than ever before, there is a lot of talk about depression. I've seen estimates that as many as 20% of the population of developed nations suffers from depression. And there are degrees of this phenomenon. Clinical depression is reportedly the most serious, where people cannot function in their daily lives and are on suicide watches, all due to this monster called depression. Yet depression itself does not exist. You cannot bring home a container of depression to examine, clean up, and eliminate from your life. There is no depression per se. There are only people thinking depressing thoughts. Certainly there are people who are convinced that they suffer from depression. There is an entire pharmaceutical industry devoted to mass-producing drugs to combat this diagnosis. In many cases, medication appears to reduce the symptoms of despair or hopelessness, such as poor appetite, sleeplessness, lack of self-esteem, and a general feeling of ennui. Some professionals say depression is psychological. Others insist that it is a chemical imbalance. But one thing is for sure, in our industrialized Western world, we believe depression is a real, very real problem. In a classic book, From Medication to Meditation, Osho writes, "The problem of depression is not the underdeveloped countries. It's not in underdeveloped countries. In poor countries, people are still hopeful. It is only in the developed countries where they have everything that they have always longed for. They have achieved the goal, and this achievement of the goal is the cause of depression. Now there is no hope. Tomorrow is dark, and the day after tomorrow will be even darker." If you've been trained to believe that your worth is in all this external stuff, then when you begin to feel that you have nothing more to gain, that the challenges of life are all met, and see that you can have any material thing you want, then you lose your inner spark of life. You may or may not have already have all the stuff. The point is that you are in a time and a culture that stimulates your desire to compete for more of it, even when it is meaningless. And in a society that's taught to run after dollars, and everywhere there is this frantic push for money and all that it can buy, you begin to postpone even glancing at the beauty and grandeur of nature, other human beings, and all of life. A contemplative spiritual life of communing with God and knowing your higher self is set aside in favor of attracting more money, yet the money does not give the satisfaction. When your emphasis is the inner spiritual energy of love, peace, rejoicing, cheerfulness, celebration, kindness, you cannot know debilitating depression. Putting spirit aside and pursuing dollars in the mistaken belief that money can purchase anything and everything leads you to this discovery that you cannot purchase what you really crave the most. If your entire life is devoted to that which you know is in your heart is meaningless, then you give birth to the mental process we label depression. An illusion, to be sure, but something you will believe nevertheless. Gradually, this mental condition will infect everyone close to you, including your children. They will believe the illusion. All will react to the low-energy thoughts of depression and despair, tension, worry, and fear, and the health of their bodies begin to suffer. In the low energy of depression, we identify or diagnose the chemical imbalances that result and conclude that we need to restore that chemistry to its natural harmonious level. We pour chemicals into our bodies, and we see some changes: less despair, more harmony, less tension, more cheerfulness. We conclude that depression is cured with drugs and chemicals. Why the body-mind is out of balance should have been the first question. Depression, like stress, is internally generated by one's attitude. Could it be that the one crucial ingredient that represents a spiritual solution to this massive problem of depression is hope? Penny. A word about hope. At the core of our being, rooted deep within our soul, there is a knowing that we are indestructible. We have the hope of immortality, of life after death, which is an incentive for moral perfection. The inner knowing is hope, and it's a stepping stone to the awakening of the soul. It is that still but restless voice inside of you that beckons you to a higher, faster energy. In a sense, hope is the restoration of the appetite for life itself, and all the bliss that accompanies a renunciation of the search for meaning and power in the material world. The story of Buddha is well known. A prince who had everything and realized it did not give him enlightenment. He renounced the pursuit of the material in search of a different path, which led to a place where spirit presided over the illusory world of the material. I do not suggest that this is necessary for you to renounce all of your physical and material possessions in order to find bliss, although I'm not discounting it either. I merely ask you to consider the importance that losing one's appetite for life plays in manifesting despair and depression in your life. I encourage you to replace the unrelenting pursuit of dollars, which can never purchase happiness, with an intention of creating a deeper and richer experience of life. Hope then will literally be replacing despair. Depression, clinical or otherwise, will be impossible. I view the presence of so much enculturated belief in depression in contemporary Western society as a moral crisis because it represents a maladaptive search for the sacred within all of us. I know also that when we give up our reliance on external indices of success and realize that they strip us of our ability to live at a spiritual energy level, then we replace despair with a renewed sense of hope, and depression is impossible. What follows are some suggestions for bringing this sense of hope and spiritual consciousness to anything that smacks of despair, gloom, or depression. Suggestions for turning despair to hope. Begin to take delight in non-attachment. Through raising our own awareness, you can love without being attached. And attached love creates despair because you are placing the source of your fulfillment and happiness on someone else. If they refuse to cooperate in the way that you feel they must, then you must move into despair. Instead, have hope for yourself. You can love anyone and appreciate him or her for who they are without telling yourself that you will be devastated if they let you down. Anthony DeMello has 2 extremely powerful affirmations in The Way to Love that will help you experience love in a non-attached way. 1, I am not really attached to you at all. I am merely deluding myself into the belief that without you I will not be happy. 2, I leave you free to be yourself, to think your thoughts, indulge your tastes, follow your inclinations, behave in ways that you decide are to your liking. When you observe these 2 recommendations for detached love, you will notice that the person becomes important to you in the same way that a rainbow or a concert are lovely in themselves. You set yourself free in a compelling way. Love actually intensifies, all despair is dissolved, and you have hope in your heart rather than pain that attachments bring. Practice in reinforcing hope rather than despair. Don't be an enabler of despair by commiserating with those who are feeling low. I once took a vow as a counselor-therapist that I would always seek to have my clients put the emphasis on their successes rather than the things that brought about feelings of despair. For instance, I encouraged a client who was able unable to get along with his parents, to examine the brief times when he felt he had successful interactions with them. I pushed him to recount any moments of success, how he felt, what he thought, what were the results, how his day went at the times of success, and so on. By looking for any signs of success, I would make the counseling sessions experiences of hope rather than reinforcers of despair. Similarly, clients with addictions and even chronic pain all had moments in their lives when they felt successful at handling their problems. 1 week of not overeating, 3 days of not drinking, 1 day, 1 pain-free day. All these kinds of experiences provide an opportunity to remember that the power to replace despair with hope, if only for a day or so, is available. If it can be done for 1 day, then 2 days is not so outrageous, and you have a hopeful idea. I found that reinforcing negatives, talking about causes, rehashing hurt feelings, and reliving painful emotions often serve to reinforce a feeling of hopelessness in the present moment. As a counselor, I wanted to bring hope to despair, and in the process to help to nullify despair for good. This logic applies to despair in your life. Recall past moments when you felt a degree of hope and success in handling a problem, and try to recreate the thoughts and feelings that you were experiencing. By doing so, you give yourself a roadmap out of your despair. By reinforcing hope, you will act on those new thoughts and feelings. Remember to call God and literally turn the despair over to God. You can end an experience of despair by making the present moment decision to let it go in a moment of silent prayer, saying, I can't handle this situation alone. I know that you're here with me as my silent senior partner. I'm entrusting this to you. This quiet, simple prayer will give you immediate relief from the feelings of despair. This is a way of letting go of the idea that all is hopeless. In essence, what you're doing with the prayer is asking that love guide your life. It is a way of emptying your agenda and utilizing power that resolves the planets around the sun, keeps the sun in place, and turns a seed into a flower or a baby. It is far superior to saying, I'll do this all by myself. By asking for divine intervention, you can step back and allow yourself to symbolically take God's hand. This advice is as ancient as the scriptures. Utilize it and release yourself from the drama of your despair. In 5 short words, you can bring hope to despair and effect a spiritual solution to any problem related to that despair. Ask and you shall receive. Act as if the hope you have for the relief of despair is already here and in place. Rather than your normal reaction to despair of being inactive, speaking in terms of hopelessness, complaining, and fault-finding, feeling self-pity and pessimism, create a picture of how you would like everything to work out and firmly make a commitment to act as if what you want is already here. If you want more abundance, get a picture of yourself already received material blessings. Go and sit in the car of your dreams in the showroom. Visualize yourself driving it. Then hold that picture in your consciousness. The way will be shown to you. As I said in Manifest Your Destiny, your job is not to say how, it's to say yes. Despair is really just an image in our minds. In reality, we are whatever we decide to think in the face of any circumstance, and choosing to see that problem as dissolved is in fact the replacement of despair with hope. In the midst of suffering, make a conscious effort to see the blessing. This is a powerful tool for eliminating despair. When you're feeling most distressed and things seem to be going from bad to worse, try stopping for an instant and asking yourself, how are you going to grow from this experience? Then listen to your inner voice and stay open to something good appearing as the drama of despair continues to unfold. Tuning into your silence gives you the energy to get through the despair and grow in the process. When you let go of the despairing thoughts, you bring in the higher, faster energy, which ultimately displaces the illusion of your despair. When it seems impossible to stop in the midst of turmoil and suffering and search for blessings, remember that all the times that seemed so traumatic in the past now seem, in retrospect, to have been valuable growth experiences. The former alcoholic almost always blesses his drunkenness. The wealthy person praises his earlier poverty. The recovered heart attack patient values the experience of illness. The happy couple extols the pain of their separation. Every despairing time has served to bring you to a higher, happier place in your life. Therefore, I urge you to stop considering any life experience in terms of despair. Imagine yourself looking back at this particular moment and use the hope of growing beneficially from the experience to stop self-pity. Let despair dissolve into gratitude for the opportunity it truly represents. The St. Francis prayer concludes with this line: "It is in dying that we are born to eternal life." I suggest that it is in the dying of despair and moment that a spiritual birth takes place. By seeing the blessing in despair as it is occurring, your birth, the elixir of hope. Don't let yourself be a sounding board for the sorrowful tales of others. Some people love to recite stories of despair and disaster. The more despairing the details, the more they seem to take pleasure in retelling them. In many ways, this brings the despair that they are recounting into your life as well. I find it helpful to simply let it be known that I do not choose to wallow in any despair, my own or that of others. When I'm bombarded by stories such as the death reports, illness reports, accident reports, poor weather reports, crime reports, and so on, I nod politely and point out the potential blessing in what I'm hearing. Like grandma's now in God's hands and will never ever be again in suffering. This kind of calculated response politely tell the person who loves to dwell on despair and abuse others with their disasterizing that you prefer to discuss what is good about the situation. Bring hope to these kinds of bombardments, and the atmosphere immediately shifts away from despair. Practice the art of being an eternal optimist. People who are eternal optimists are often called Pollyannas, as if this was a criticism. To me, being called a Pollyanna, which I've been on many occasions, is a compliment. Here was a town in which everyone was depressed. The people were gloomy, the economy was bad, everyone hated everything about their lives and their community. Pessimism reigned. Into this picture strolls a little girl named Pollyanna. Within a few weeks, everyone is cheerful, people are being kind to each other, and the economy has picked up because of Pollyanna's attitude. The Secret Garden is another wonderful story of the triumph of a young girl's optimism during the imagined illness of a young, spoiled boy. I also recommend you watch The Barretts of Wimpole Street, a movie that depicts how the famed poet Robert Browning helped transform a sickly, pessimistic Elizabeth Barrett into a vibrant woman who later became his wife. These kinds of stories promote the importance of optimism. When I'm criticized as hopeless Pollyanna, I always say thank you. What better role model than someone whose presence inspires hope where despair played a dominant role previously? Be persistent in acting as if it is impossible to fail. I love this quotation by Louis Pasteur. Let me tell you the secret that has led me to my goal. My strength lies solely in my tenacity. I suggest that you become like a pit bull holding onto a bone called hope. Keep a death grip on that bone called hope, regardless of what comes along, and regardless of the obstacles and so-called failures that have previously induced despair. When you feel the despairing thoughts returning, shift your thoughts to an intention of making things work out. I remind myself of the old maxim, this too shall pass. And I reaffirm my unwillingness to give up on myself. This inner tenacity is infectious. St. Francis, whose famous prayer is the basis for a good part of this book, refused to give up on what he knew was a calling from God. His parents and family tried everything to dissuade him from his obsession with Jesus and devotion to spirit, yet he persisted like that pit bull's grip on the bone. He simply knew that he couldn't fail because his faith was so great, and obstacles became opportunities for hope rather than contributing to an attitude of despair. Who knows, perhaps one day you'll have a lovely city like San Francisco named after you. I'm sure you've heard Winston Churchill's stirring words as he rallied his countrymen to stand up for the honor of freedom in the face of an immense cloud of despair. Never give in, never, 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 never. In nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. Endure and persist. The pain will ultimately turn to your good. This is the value of persistence in bringing hope to the illusion of despair. Wherever, whenever you encounter despair, be it in yourself or in others, remind yourself on the spot to shift to that higher, faster energy of spirit. Radiate that energy directly to what you believe to be the source of despair. Surround the imagined source with light and the unconditional love of God. Eventually, but most assuredly, you will sure bring hope to that imagined despair, and by doing so, you will have taken another step toward knowing that there truly is a spiritual solution to every problem.